Hello everyone, Phil Snyder. Hey, today I want to do a video on Utah House Bill 84, the School Security Safety Act. I'm just going to give you my take on this whole thing that they've done, the pros and the cons, and probably how we could improve that moving forward. I understand that it was a very large bill that took a lot of effort from our lawmakers and input from law enforcement, but as with both big projects, they're not going to be flawless, and there's probably going to be a need to make adjustments to get it perfected. I think overall the bill is very encouraging, but there are definitely some rough edges to work out. Number one, what I wanted to talk about was the conflicts with this House Bill 84 and with the other bill they did this same year, House Bill 369. And what I'm talking about is how they've revised the defensive habitation statute under 762405 and how that is in conflict with the teachers or the school guardians and the armed security guards that are going to be asked to step up to protect these schools. So the conflict is under the defensive habitation statute. What they've done is, out of good faith, I think, they have included places of employment, places of business, and occupied vehicles under the defensive habitation statute. And I think, though it was well intended, it's creating problems, and let me tell you why. Number one, armed security guards and school guardians that are tasked under this mandatory coverage in the schools because their use of deadly force that's going to be applied under 405, because this includes their places of employment, the use of deadly force is going to be scrutinized under that statute. One particular thing I noticed under this new defensive habitation change, whether it was intentional or not, it appears that they have drawn red lines through words like reasonably believing the deadly force is necessary, thus creating a lot of ambiguity as to whether we still have a reasonable standard of deploying deadly force or if we have a necessary standard. Some attorneys that I've talked to that have read that language, some agree that Utah has raised that standard to a necessary standard, and some attorneys at best will just say that it's definitely ambiguous as to what he's done, and it could create some very undesirable potential appeals for these school guardians and these armed security guards using deadly force in these jobs at these schools that they're tasked in doing so. So I have written out to representatives and asking for clarification on those issues. God forbid, before a school volunteer or an armed security guard has to go through a costly legal appeal due to those changes that were made in the statute. Also, the bill does not include immunity for these school guardians and armed security guards that are tasked with protecting these schools. They should have immunity, qualified immunity, just as law enforcement officers do, if this is going to be a mandate for these entities to do this. Guardians, they have civil liability protections if they don't act grossly negligent and they act in good faith, but that's not the same thing as qualified immunity, and so they need to do more. What the bill does is it has granted $100 million into the fund. It's a one-time funding, and it also allows for $4 million per year for ongoing expenses to implement this program and to keep it going. But everybody knows, and the school board members that I've talked to, this is impossible, and this is not enough money to provide an SRO or those other entities into these schools. Okay, so the positives, what I see is it seems to provide more accountability in bullying and threat reporting into the Utah Safe app, which is definitely, that's something that I really like. It also includes mental health awareness and de-escalation training into the Guardians' mandatory 24 hours of training yearly that they're required to do. That's great. Some negatives that I see with this is it's not going to fund a school resource officer or these other volunteers or armed security guards. It's not going to fund one in every school. The other negative is that it appears that this is all controlled by state officials and law enforcement, and it's, in my opinion, putting too much burden on law enforcement. They are tasked with providing all of the training for these school resource guardian or resource officers and guardians. And I saw a press release where Sheriff Mike Smith of Utah County was mentioning how much of a burden what this was on the shoulders of law enforcement, and I couldn't agree more. Law enforcement is already short-handed with all the defund the police movement people out there, and I'm just very concerned that they're not going to be able to, number one, provide school resource officers, because priority, in my opinion, is going to go to the street, and that they don't have the manpower or the time to provide training for all of these volunteer guardians. Let me tell you some qualities in selecting a good school resource officer or armed security guard for the job, particularly to the initial what I mentioned. Number one quality in selecting a school resource officer should be a desire to protect kids. Let me go a little bit further. There should be a desire to lay down their life for those children in those schools. Number one. Number two, they should have a CIT certification. And so for those of you that don't know what that is, they should go through a 40-hour school, crisis intervention team school, where that is overseen by the Utah Department of Substance Abuse and Mental Health, and they are recognized by the state of Utah as mental health officers. A good school resource officer should be proactive in averting threats. They should have great problem-solving abilities and investigative skills. I think at least 2 years experience in patrol should be a minimum standard. Ideally, if they've been through a SWAT training school or have at least had some active shooter training. What I've typically seen in my law enforcement career is they select school resource officers, and this is just from my experience as a 30-year law enforcement officer. Typically, the way they have selected these school resource officers in the past is, well, they want to work day shift, and so, they don't have to work graveyard shift or afternoon shift, or maybe they want to have some time off in the summer when the schools are closed. And so that's, pretty much what I've seen. That is not how you select a school resource officer. You select them for the above reasons. It should be a desirable job. It should be an assignment that is highly sought after, and there should be competition to do that in the schools. Some recommendations that I can make, okay? Number one, because of the burden on law enforcement, why is the state not utilizing their certified concealed firearms instructors that are approved by the Department of Public Safety under the same umbrella of government to provide the mandatory concealed firearm permit courses that guardians are required to have, as well as these pistol courses that they're required to go through? That alone, if the state would allow these certified instructors through the Department of Public Safety to provide the firearms end and the concealed carry end of the training, that's about 12 hours of training out of that 24 hours of training. So that's about half that will relieve law enforcement officers' ability to do that. And the standard of an NRA basic pistol course, which is one of them that would be required, is, in my opinion, a higher standard than what they would receive otherwise. So that should be something to think about. Also, something else. Consider using veterans and retired law enforcement officers that have separated or retired in good standing to volunteer as guardians. They should be able to qualify for that. I know a lot of retired Utah law enforcement officers that would just love to go protect a school. They need to make changes with Utah Peace Officer Standards and Training, okay, to reactivate those law enforcement officer certifications that have lapsed for more than 4 years. Currently, if a law enforcement officer has retired for a period of longer than 4 years, the only way they can become a law enforcement officer again is to go back to the academy, and nobody's probably going to do that. So why not just allow law enforcement officers to come back and have their peace officer certification reinstated, maybe with a state test, just to test their knowledge and let them come back. And that would really open up a very large qualified pool of school guardians, or maybe even for school resource officers for that matter. If they've got their peace officer certification reinstated for these retired folks that maybe they've had a change in their life circumstances and they'd like to take another job, they can do that. Another thing to consider is, because schools are not going to be able to fund a school resource officer in every school throughout the state, K through 12, why not consider having maybe like a roving school resource officer that, maybe will spend, a week or two at each school and train the school to protect their schools independently through education and knowledge, focusing on mental health awareness and threat mitigation. You don't necessarily need a gun to prevent school shootings. Most school shootings can be prevented through early intervention. Early intervention is key, okay? And accountability. What I've seen in a number of school shootings in the nation is there has been a lack of accountability in these school shootings. And let me just give Parkland, Florida, as an example. That shooter in that Parkland high school that shot 34 people and killed 17 of those, law enforcement was aware of that person before he carried out that deadly shooting that ended in less than 4 minutes. But somebody in law enforcement, not more than one entity, dropped the ball on that and allowed that guy to come in there. And had there been accountability, that shooting, in my opinion, could have been prevented. But that didn't happen, and that has happened in other cases as well. I could just go on and on this, and I think everybody's aware of who it is. Accountability in threat reporting and assessments is crucial. Education in schools and with parents on the above, emphasis on community involvement is crucial. Volunteers and school resource officers and school guardians are not enough. It's not enough, and it's not going to be adequately protected without involvement from the community. It's always been that way. Go back to old-fashioned community policing, okay? And the police themselves will admit, and they should admit, that it's very difficult to do their job without help from the community. The community are the eyes and ears for law enforcement. And we have to get more education out there to the community, to the students, the peers, the parents, where the kids come home and they talk about how their day was at school and talk about how Johnny made a threat and they thought it was a joke to maybe bring a gun to a school. Report these issues and spread education and how to have adequate strategies for situations like this. We all need to be involved. Nearly all of these can be prevented, and I have data to back it up. There needs to be accountability for all, including mental health clinicians. I hope this video was helpful, and please share it with any educators, school employees, or anybody else, maybe any lawmakers or tasked with this very difficult and challenging bill to keep our kids safe. Thanks a lot.